It was a brisk Tuesday morning when the usual hum of activity filled the Providence Municipal Court, the sound of papers rustling, the shuffle of footsteps, and the murmur of voices talking about traffic violations, small claims, and the typical cases that were part of the everyday grind of local justice. These were the cases that occupied most of the court's time: fines, debts, minor infractions. For the regulars in the room, this was another day, another round of paperwork and bureaucracy to handle. But something felt different today. There was a palpable tension in the air, as if something far bigger than the usual proceedings was about to unfold. As the room filled with the expected sounds of busy proceedings, the door at the back of the courtroom swung open with a soft creak. The silence that followed could have been mistaken for a whisper of wind. Then, all eyes turned toward the man who entered. It wasn't just any defendant that walked through the door. It was Police Chief Marcus Holloway, the very man who had commanded respect in the city for decades, dressed in his full police uniform. Holloway's appearance was nothing short of imposing. His navy blue jacket, crisp and perfectly pressed, caught the fluorescent lights above, making the numerous medals adorning his chest gleam as though they had been polished to perfection. His chief's badge, which gleamed brightly against the dark fabric of his uniform, shone like a beacon, a symbol of his authority and power in Providence. Holloway's very presence in the room seemed to command the space, as if the walls themselves should bow to him. He had spent 28 years building an empire of authority, one that spanned over 340 officers and countless political connections. To the public, he was more than just a police chief. He was a pillar of law and order, a man who stood as the face of authority, the man everyone turned to in times of crisis. And now he was the one in the defendant's chair, facing serious charges that could bring down everything he had built. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Holloway, the man who had spent years issuing orders, was now in the position where he had to follow them. The world he had shaped was suddenly shifting beneath his feet. Holloway's walk into the courtroom was deliberate and composed, his military perfect stride and his posture shoulders square. Chin up projected the image of a man who had commanded respect for decades. He walked through the courtroom not as a humble defendant, but as someone who believed that this entire proceeding was beneath him. The way he moved, measured, confident, but slightly aloof, made it clear that he considered this court appearance a mere formality, a bureaucratic inconvenience to be dealt with swiftly. He had bigger battles to fight, or so he thought. The room, which had been filled with the usual low murmur of court business, fell into an uncanny silence. The atmosphere became heavy, thick with anticipation. Whispers began to ripple through the gallery, spreading like an electric current. People who had been checking their phones, distracted by the mundane proceedings of the day, suddenly looked up. Sensing that something out of the ordinary was unfolding, everyone in the room knew exactly who Marcus Holloway was. He wasn't just any police chief. He was the man who had rebuilt the police department after a massive corruption scandal 10 years ago. He had been the face of law enforcement in Providence for nearly 3 decades, the man seen on TV during every major crisis, every police-related incident in the city. When there was danger, when there was trouble, it was Holloway's name that people turned to. His face was a constant presence on the news, and his voice was the one that reassured the public, no matter the situation. His authority, his reputation, and his career had made him an institution in the city. But now, that institution was facing its greatest challenge. Now, Holloway wasn't walking into this courtroom as a hero or as a man of power. He was walking in as a defendant, his fate hanging in the balance. The stark reality of the situation began to settle in. This wasn't a routine appearance. This wasn't just another day at court. This was the beginning of something that could very well change the course of his life and career forever. Judge Frank Caprio, a seasoned veteran with over 30 years of experience on the bench, raised his gaze from the papers in front of him. His expression was calm, almost neutral, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that was unmistakable. He had seen it all: liars, criminals, the genuinely remorseful, and the arrogantly defiant. But today, he would face something different. As Holloway stood before him, Judge Caprio addressed him with a steady, No-nonsense voice. "Chief Holloway, please remove your hat in my courtroom." The words were simple, almost routine, but they carried immense weight. In every courtroom, no matter how powerful one might be outside its walls, the rules were the same. Everyone who entered the courtroom was expected to show respect for the court, regardless of their title or position. Holloway, however, hesitated. His jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, the facade of invincibility cracked. The chief was no longer in control. For a few seconds, Holloway stood there, facing a decision that would be symbolic of the larger battle to come. Finally, Holloway removed his cap. But instead of handing it to his lawyer, or simply tucking it away, he placed it deliberately on the defendant's table, the badge facing Judge Caprio. It was a subtle, calculated gesture, a reminder that Holloway was complying, but not without asserting his dominance in the process. His badge, his authority, still had a presence in the courtroom, even if it wasn't in his hands. The room held its breath. Everyone was watching, waiting to see how this would play out. The subtle challenge in Holloway's gesture didn't go unnoticed. Judge Caprio, though, remained unfazed. His face remained impassive as he opened the file in front of him, prepared to carry on with the proceedings. But the courtroom had changed. The quiet, respectful atmosphere had shifted. Holloway's belief in his untouchability had just been put to the test, and this was only the beginning. Holloway's defiance was clear, but Caprio wasn't going to let this slide. The battle between institutional power and judicial integrity was just starting, and the first sparks of conflict had already been ignited. As the courtroom quieted, Judge Caprio's voice cut through the tense atmosphere with a calm but firm delivery. "Chief Marcus Holloway, you are charged with abuse of authority, intimidation of a city official, and obstruction of justice." These weren't just any charges. They weren't small offenses or technicalities. They were serious and had the potential to shake the very foundations of Holloway's career. Each charge carried weight. Abuse of authority, intimidation, obstruction, all stemming from an incident that had unfolded just weeks before. One that took place in the parking garage of City Hall, an incident that now had the power to unravel everything. Holloway had spent decades building. Holloway's response came almost instantly. Too quickly for a man who had built his life on carefully calculated words. His face, still composed but showing slight irritation, betrayed the first crack in his well-polished exterior. "Your Honor, there has been a serious misunderstanding regarding how the chain of command works in this city." The words spilled out. His attempt to shift the blame, to downplay the gravity of the situation, evident in his tone. Holloway was a man accustomed to being in charge, not answering questions, and certainly not being challenged. The courtroom was not his arena. He wasn't used to sitting on the receiving end of scrutiny. Judge Caprio, however, wasn't swayed by Holloway's deflection. "Do you understand the charges against you?" Caprio's voice remained even, unwavering, as though he had anticipated this moment. He wasn't about to let Holloway sidestep the reality of what he was facing. There was no room for games here. The question was simple, direct, and Holloway had no choice but to answer. For the first time, Holloway shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His posture, which had been erect and confident when he entered, now betrayed signs of irritation. The leader who had once given orders to hundreds of officers, the man who commanded entire precincts with a glance, now found himself facing the full weight of a court that did not care about his rank. For a fleeting moment, Holloway's command of the room seemed to falter. "Yes, Your Honor," he said reluctantly. "But what I don't understand is why we're treating a professional disagreement as a criminal matter." The words came out clipped, defensive. He still didn't fully grasp the situation. To him, this was just a misunderstanding, a minor issue blown out of proportion. It was a matter of policy, he believed, a simple clash of opinions between two city officials. But the charges he was facing had far more serious implications than Holloway seemed ready to acknowledge. The courtroom, however, wasn't ready to let Holloway off the hook so easily. His attempt to dismiss the seriousness of the situation only fueled the sense of unease that had settled over the gallery. The room was filled with the hushed sounds of spectators shifting in their seats. Eager to hear the details of the case, the details of the charges that Holloway had so casually attempted to downplay. And as the tension mounted, Holloway's high-pressed defense attorney, Richard Sterling, leaned forward in an effort to steer the conversation away from the impending storm. "Your Honor?" "If I may," Sterling interjected, his voice measured and calm. He was a seasoned attorney, one used to defending powerful clients, and he knew exactly how to navigate these turbulent waters. He was hoping to regain control of the situation, to redirect the narrative. "My client is here in good faith to address what we believe is a gross mischaracterization of a conversation that took place between two city officials who have a long history of policy disagreements." Sterling's tone was polished, professional, a stark contrast to the increasingly hostile environment around them. He was trying to spin the conversation in a way that would minimize the damage to Holloway's reputation. Judge Caprio acknowledged Sterling's comments with a nod. "Your client will have ample opportunity to present his defense," Caprio said, his voice still firm. "But first, let's establish the facts as alleged." The judge wasn't interested in the defense yet. He needed the full context of the case, and he was determined to lay the groundwork before allowing Holloway's legal team to counter the charges. At this moment, the prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Sarah Chen, took center stage. Chen was known for taking on cases that others avoided, especially those involving powerful figures like Holloway. She had built a reputation for fearlessly tackling corruption and bringing those in power to account. Standing tall, she began outlining the specifics of the complaint that had led to Holloway's charges. Her presence in the courtroom was commanding. Her focus was razor-sharp. With clear authority, Sarah Chen began to lay out the details of the March 14th incident. On the evening of March 14th at approximately 7:45 p.m., Councilwoman Maria Rodriguez was leaving a city council meeting, Chen said, her voice steady as she recounted the sequence of events. Rodriguez had just presented a proposal for an independent civilian oversight board for the police department, a proposal that had been carefully prepared over months, one that was meant to provide greater transparency and accountability for the department. As she made her way to her vehicle in the parking garage, she was approached by Chief Holloway, who had attended the meeting earlier but had left before it concluded. The room listened in rapt attention. This wasn't just a minor encounter. It was a moment that would define the direction of Holloway's career. Holloway's defense, which had appeared solid just moments ago, now seemed shaky. He was facing accusations that not only involved abuse of power, but also intimidation and obstruction of justice. And Sarah Chen wasn't about to let him escape the gravity of those charges. As Sarah Chen continued to lay out the details of the incident, it became clear that what Holloway had initially dismissed as a misunderstanding was, in fact, a much larger and more dangerous issue. Holloway's once secure position was now in jeopardy. And the truth about what happened in that parking garage was beginning to emerge in full. Would Holloway's defense hold up, or would the evidence against him be too much to ignore? Sarah Chen's voice echoed in the silence of the courtroom as she continued to present the statement from Councilwoman Maria Rodriguez. The weight of the accusations was clear. Maria had presented her proposal for an independent civilian oversight board aimed at reforming the police department. A bold and much-needed step toward transparency and accountability in a department that had been plagued by past scandals. After the meeting, Maria Rodriguez had left the city council chambers and made her way to the parking garage to head home, unaware that her night was about to take a dark turn. According to Rodriguez, Chief Holloway had approached her in the nearly empty parking garage, an unsettling figure. Holloway had left the meeting early, and it seemed that he had been waiting for the right moment to confront her. As she neared her car, he positioned himself deliberately between her and the vehicle, blocking her path with no intention of moving. The words Holloway spoke next, as described by Rodriguez, were more than just casual conversation. They were threats designed to intimidate, to control. "You don't know who you're messing with," Holloway allegedly said, his tone laced with menace. "I know where you live. I know where your kids go to school." The room seemed to hold its breath as Sarah Chen continued. Holloway's words didn't stop there. "Every cop in this city answers to me. You'll never feel safe again." These weren't idle threats, these were statements of power, meant to instill fear in someone who had dared challenge Holloway's authority. The gallery, once filled with a quiet murmur of whispers, had grown eerily silent. The impact of these accusations hit everyone in the room like a wave. Holloway, once a respected figure who commanded the obedience of his officers, was now being painted as the aggressor. The calculated nature of his threats became all too clear. He wasn't simply angry, he was attempting to assert his dominance over someone who had the audacity to challenge the system he controlled. Judge Caprio, who had been watching Holloway closely, raised his hand with the same quiet authority he had carried throughout his long tenure on the bench. The room fell into an even deeper silence. "These are serious allegations, Chief Holloway," Caprio said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of the situation. His eyes never left Holloway as he continued. "Is Councilwoman Rodriguez present?" Sarah Chen nodded firmly, her eyes meeting Judge Caprio's. "She is available via video conference." "Your Honor." The screen behind Caprio flickered to life, and Maria Rodriguez's image appeared on the screen. She appeared calm, composed, but anyone could see the tension in her posture and the subtle signs of strain on her face. The emotional toll of this case was evident. She was about to relive a traumatic experience, and the eyes of the entire courtroom were fixed on her. Judge Caprio, understanding the weight of the moment, spoke gently. "Councilwoman, in your own words, please tell us what happened on the evening of March 14th. Ha! His tone was measured, empathetic, but there was no mistaking the gravity of the situation. Maria Rodriguez took a deep breath. Her hands clasped together on the desk in front of her. Her voice, though steady, carried an undeniable weight. "I had just finished presenting my proposal for civilian oversight to the City Council," she began, her voice calm but laced with emotion. "It's something I've been working on for months, gathering community input, researching best practices from other cities. It was scheduled for a vote the following week." She continued, recounting how she had stayed behind after the meeting to answer questions from other council members. But when she finally left the building, it was dark. The parking garage was nearly empty, and she was alone, walking to her car. Unaware that Holloway had been waiting for her, I heard footsteps behind me. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, Maria recalled. Her voice tightened slightly. I turned and saw Chief Holloway. He wasn't in uniform, just a suit, but I recognized him immediately. He had been sitting in the back of the meeting earlier. I said hello, tried to be polite, but he didn't return the greeting. He just kept walking toward me. Maria paused for a moment, her eyes briefly closing as if trying to steady herself. When I reached my car, I went to open the door, but he stepped in front of it, blocking my way. Not aggressively, but deliberately. Her words hung in the air, the power of her testimony radiating through the courtroom. Maria took another deep breath, continuing. He said, "That was an interesting presentation tonight," and I thanked him. I tried to keep it professional, but then he said, "You really think you can investigate my department? You think you can second-guess my officers?" Maria's voice dropped slightly as she relived the moment. I told him that the Oversight Board wasn't about second-guessing, that it was about transparency and accountability. Then she described how Holloway's demeanor changed. His attitude shifted from calm to confrontational, and his words grew more threatening. He moved closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne, she said, her voice almost a whisper. He said, "You don't know who you're messing with." Maria paused, the memory of Holloway's words and presence clearly weighing on her. She continued, her voice steady, but filled with the realization of how deeply Holloway's words had impacted her. Then he said, "I know where you live, Maria." He used my first name, which felt too personal, too invasive. Then he added, "I know where your kids go to school. Lincoln Elementary, right? Your daughter's in Mrs. Patterson's 4th grade class." Maria's eyes lowered for a moment, a tear rolling down her cheek as she continued. "Your Honor, my daughter's classroom is not public information." The fact that he knew that specific detail terrified me. I didn't know if I was in danger, if my kids were in danger. Judge Caprio's expression hardened as Maria continued. I asked him to move, but he didn't. He just kept talking. He said, "Every cop in this city answers to me. Every single one. You pushed this oversight board through. and you'll find out what it's like when nobody comes when you call. 911. You'll never feel safe again. Maria's testimony painted a chilling picture of intimidation, one that Holloway could no longer deny. The consequences of his actions were unfolding in real time, and the question now was whether Holloway would continue to deny his behavior, or if he would finally admit to the gravity of his threats. With the case taking a darker turn, what would the defense say next? As the gravity of the situation settled in, Holloway's earlier confidence was now unraveling before the eyes of everyone in the courtroom. The composure that had served him well for decades in the face of adversity was slipping away with each passing moment. His attempts to downplay the severity of his actions now seemed futile, and the realization was beginning to dawn on him that he was no longer in control. The courtroom, once his domain of power and authority, had become a place where his every word was under scrutiny. Holloway sat rigid in his seat, but his usual air of self-assurance had been replaced with an unmistakable tension. His face reddened with the intensity of the questions being posed to him, but he wasn't backing down. His earlier deflection had failed, but he wasn't yet ready to admit the truth of what had transpired in that parking garage. His denial was a shield, one he was trying to hold up against the mounting evidence. But it was quickly becoming clear that the truth was undeniable. When Judge Caprio turned toward him and asked, "Did you speak to Councilwoman Rodriguez in the parking garage?" Holloway hesitated for a moment. His jaw tightened, and his eyes darted nervously across the room. It was a simple question, yet it felt like the walls were closing in. Finally, with a slight sigh, Holloway answered, "Yes, I spoke to her that night." He was finally admitting the truth, but even this admission came with a deflection. "But what she just described," Holloway continued, "is a complete distortion of what happened." The words hung in the air like an echo, and the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. It was as though Holloway had just dug himself deeper into the hole he had been trying to avoid. He wasn't willing to take responsibility for the way he had behaved. Instead, he was painting Rodriguez as the one who was twisting the facts. It was a desperate attempt to maintain control over a situation that was slipping out of his hands. Judge Caprio, however, was unyielding. His gaze never wavered from Holloway as he pressed further, his voice steady and commanding. "Did you mention her children, Chief Holloway?" The question was direct, a straightforward attempt to uncover the heart of the intimidation claims. Holloway's face reddened even more. His eyes flicked down briefly before he answered, trying to maintain composure but clearly rattled. "I may have mentioned seeing her at a school event," Holloway responded, his tone defensive. "It's a small city, Your Honor." Holloway's attempt to justify the mention of her children was weak at best. A school event? That was a flimsy excuse in the face of the more serious allegations against him. The courtroom was watching, and it was clear that his words were not convincing anyone. The deflection wasn't working, and Holloway's authority, once a formidable force, was now being questioned. Judge Caprio's expression remained unchanged. He had seen enough. He wasn't fooled by Holloway's justifications. "The issue before this court," Caprio said, his voice cutting through the tension in the room, "is not about civilian oversight. The issue is whether you used your position to intimidate a public official. And based on what I've heard, the evidence is overwhelming." Caprio's words were like a hammer striking a nail. There was no escaping the truth now. Holloway had tried to sidestep the allegations by focusing on the finer details, but the core issue had been made crystal clear. This wasn't about the policy disagreements or the Civilian Oversight Board. It was about the abuse of power. About a public official using their authority to intimidate, threaten someone who had dared challenge that power. The room was still. The air seemed thick with the weight of Caprio's words. Holloway sat silently, his hands clenched into fists on the table, but it was too late to salvage his defense. The charges against him were more than just legal. They were personal, and they struck at the heart of his authority. His arrogance, once a source of strength, had now become his greatest weakness. The judge had laid out the truth plainly, and Holloway had no choice but to confront it. With the evidence against him mounting and Holloway's defense collapsing, the final showdown between power and justice was fast approaching. Caprio's next move would determine the fate of the once feared police chief. Would Holloway finally come to terms with Heist's actions? or would his hubris lead to a fall from grace he couldn't avoid? The tension in the courtroom had reached its peak. Holloway's defiance was palpable, his body language tense as he tried to maintain his sense of control in a situation where his power had completely eroded. He continued to argue, to lash out, as if he could somehow twist the narrative back in his favor. But Judge Caprio remained resolute, unflinching in the face of Holloway's growing frustration. "Chief Holloway, you've confessed to more than just the actions of one night," Caprio said, his voice steady, but imbued with an undeniable weight. "You've confessed to a belief that your badge grants you ownership over justice itself." The words hit Holloway like a slap, and his demeanor shifted visibly. The defiant, arrogant posture that had served him so well for years crumbled. For the first time, Holloway seemed to recognize the full extent of his mistake. His ego, once a shield that protected him, had now become his greatest enemy. Holloway attempted to explain himself, to twist his words into a different context, but it was clear that the judge wasn't buying it. "I own you." Those words, the very words Holloway had spoken with such ease, had now been etched into the courtroom's history. They had become the crux of his downfall, his attempt to assert dominance over a system that was meant to hold everyone accountable. Holloway had tried to use his badge to elevate himself above the law, but in doing so, he had condemned himself. Caprio didn't interrupt Holloway's desperate attempts to explain himself, but his calm demeanor remained unshaken. Instead, Caprio's voice grew softer, almost conversational, as he spoke. But every word was calculated and carried immeasurable weight. "You believe your position allows you to control everything. But let me educate you on what real power is." Caprio's eyes never left Holloway's. Piercing through the facade of authority the police chief had built over decades of service. "It's not what you think you own. It's what the law represents. And that's bigger than any badge." Caprio's words reverberated in the room, filling the space with a deep sense of finality. Holloway's belief that his badge and position afforded him the right to intimidate and control others had been shattered. His power was nothing more than an illusion. The law, as Caprio so firmly reminded him, was the true authority. It was impartial, blind, and untouchable. No badge, no title, no amount of power could place anyone above it. Holloway, for all his years of service and influence, is now learning this lesson the hard way. The room fell into an oppressive silence as Judge Caprio continued. It was clear that Holloway's fate was sealed. The weight of the judge's words and the gravity of the situation hung heavily over the courtroom. The defendant, once so proud and untouchable, was now at the mercy of the very system he had once controlled. Caprio stood, signaling the moment had arrived for the final decision. "I find you guilty on all charges: abuse of authority, intimidation of a city official, and obstruction of justice," Caprio declared. His voice rang clear and firm, and Holloway's face drained of color. The reality of his actions, the full weight of the consequences, began to sink in. He had tried to deny, deflect, and downplay his behavior, but now there was no escaping it. The man who had once been the embodiment of authority and providence was now a convicted criminal. Facing the consequences of his abuse of power, the room remained still as the judge laid out the sentence. Caprio wasn't done yet. Holloway's conviction wasn't just a matter of legal penalties. It was a statement, one that would resonate beyond the courtroom. "You are hereby fined $50,000 to be paid personally within 30 days, Caprio stated. The amount was significant, but the real impact of the fine lay in its stipulation. It was Holloway's personal assets that would cover the cost. It's not his police funds, not his pension, not a union account, his own personal wealth. It was a direct hit to Holloway's pride, a reminder that no amount of wealth or position could shield him from the consequences of his actions. But Caprio wasn't finished. He continued, his words carrying the full force of judicial authority. "Additionally, effective immediately, you are suspended from your position as police chief without pay, pending a full administrative review by the city council and the mayor's office." This was the most significant blow to Holloway's career. The very position that had once afforded him power, the office he had held for so long, was now stripped from him, leaving him in a state of limbo. His future, his career, was in jeopardy. Caprio's voice grew even firmer. A protective order is granted to Councilwoman Rodriguez. You are to have no contact with her, direct or indirect, and you are to remain at least 500 feet from her residence, her workplace, and her children's school at all times. Holloway's actions had crossed a line, and now he would face the consequences. This wasn't just a reprimand. It was a legal boundary drawn to ensure that his threats would never again have the power to harm an innocent citizen. As if these consequences weren't enough, Caprio wasn't done yet. Furthermore, the judge continued, I am referring this entire case to the state attorney general's office for investigation into potential criminal conspiracy charges. Holloway's attempts to assert his dominance had now led to far-reaching consequences. His behavior was no longer an isolated incident. It had become part of a broader pattern of corruption and abuse of power that extended far beyond the events of that night. Caprio's final words resonated with a sense of finality. I am also formally requesting that the governor of Rhode Island initiate an independent investigation into your entire tenure as police chief. With that, Holloway's fate was sealed. His empire of power had come crashing down, and the justice system had delivered its verdict. Caprio's final words rang out with clarity. No badge, no title. No amount of power can place anyone above the law. Rehook. Holloway's downfall was now complete. But the ripples of his actions would continue to echo throughout Providence. The investigation into his tenure as police chief would unfold, revealing even more about the abuses of power that had gone unchecked for years. The question remained, could any system truly be free of corruption? Or had Holloway's arrogance exposed something far more insidious?